welcome everyone to today's Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle put on by Still and Living Center every Saturday. And we are this week, as a follow-up to last week, looking at what can we do without getting ready to celebrate our plenty that we do celebrate for Thanksgiving, all the different ways that we have plenty, not just material. And so our topic for this week is wisdom and gratitude. And we're taking that up from the tradition of American Idealism. And we could say that Henry David Thoreau comes from that tradition. And we're going to look at the thoughts of Abraham Lincoln as well. And this is the anniversary of the giving of the Gettysburg Address, which is why he seemed to be a particularly good person for us to hear about. And we're hearing about it from Cliff Tillotson, who has, I've noticed since I live with him, about a dozen books between the coffee table and the bedside stand and out in his office, all on Lincoln. So I thought, yeah, I think I know the right guy to ask to speak on this topic. So he's someone who has spoken to us on many occasions. He's also spoken at the United Lodge of Theosophists. He's also spoken at the Institute of World Culture, which is a place that really I, in some ways, have patterned Still and Living Center after as a place of lifelong learning. So Cliff, can you tell us about Mr. Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, and wisdom and gratitude in preparation for Thanksgiving?
Sure, I'd love to. And I just wrote a little piece, so I'm just going to read it to you and then open it up for conversation. Almost 80 years ago on this day, November the 19th, Abraham Lincoln delivered, as requested, a few remarks at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery, which has since been universally cherished as the greatest speech in American history, giving a rebirth and forward impulse to our experiment in democracy. 50 years after President Lincoln recited his prose poem, Martin Luther King stood on the marble steps of the memorial dedicated to our greatest president and doubled down on the Gettysburg themes of freedom and equality. These two guiding and defining orations draw their power from 13 words scribed on Dutch sheepskin 12 years ago in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, and the I Have a Dream speech are three gems of America's wisdom tradition of idealism. The French philosopher Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin said that the ideal is truth at a distance. In other words, an ideal is a real truth which has not been fully embodied, practiced, or yet realized. In this sense, the word brotherhood expresses both the truth that all human beings are integral parts of one family and the striven for ideal of treating all other human beings as brothers and sisters. Founded on the high ideal of striving towards human equality and yet falling painfully short, the American psyche is restlessly unsettled by the subconscious awareness of the existential gap between where we are and where we want and hope to be. 84% of the signers of the Declaration of Independence lived with the contradiction and hypocrisy of being slave holders. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to John Holmes, slavery is like a wolf that we have got hold of by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. What the founding fathers may have implied in the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln made crystal clear and explicit in the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This Thanksgiving week's theme of wisdom and gratitude begs the question, what is the connection between wisdom and gratitude? Wisdom is of a different stock and breed than knowledge. Knowledge can be accumulated and can explain the working of things from the cell to the combustion engine to the cosmos. The main speaker of the day at Gettysburg was the great orator and teacher of Ralph Waldo Emerson at Harvard, Edward Everett. He spoke without notes for 2 hours, delivering 13,607 memorized words in his discourse. In his speech, he exhibited great knowledge of the history of Western civilization, as well as all the specific details of the 3 days of battle at Gettysburg that turned the tide of the war, along with General Grant's simultaneous victory at Vicksburg. Lincoln, on the other hand, read his short speech of 272 words in 2 minutes, and yet these charged words carried with them great wisdom and vision. As Edward Everett later wrote Lincoln, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." While you can have knowledge, you can't have wisdom. Light, wisdom can channel through one, but the minute one tries to grasp or claim it, the goddess of wisdom will coyly evade one's grasp. Wisdom is a tenuous suspension bridge between the realm of intuitive insights and creative transforming action. This is why when someone asked Pythagoras, ostensibly the wisest man in the Mediterranean world of 500 BC, if he was wise, he said, "No, but I am a lover of wisdom, a philosopher." Humility, deference, and gratitude are hallmarks of the truly wise. These attributes permeate Lincoln's address. Further, every word Lincoln ultimately chose out of his 5 known drafts was surgically precise and appropriate for the occasion. The compressed nature of the speech itself was like the tip of an iceberg of meaning and significance. Like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a visionary and eloquent call to action. Somehow this speech, with the timing of its delivery, triggered a radical paradigm shift in the minds of most Americans to see the United States as a singular country of the people, by the people, and for the people, instead of a plurality of separate states. Wisdom unifies. Through its agency of gratitude, wisdom is capable of dissolving division into concord, discord into harmony. Sarah Josepha Hale, the editor of Goody's Lady's Book and the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, understood how gratitude unites people and sharing thankfulness could begin to heal a country fractured by a war between its northern and southern citizens. So during this internal upheaval, Sarah Hale campaigned tirelessly for a national Thanksgiving festival that ultimately would be a worldwide holiday proclaiming, quote, "all nations as one brotherhood." Writing to President Lincoln, she convinced him that fixing a day for a national celebration of gratitude and thankfulness would ensure that the, quote, permanency and unity of our great American festival of Thanksgiving would be forever secured. In his proclamation declaring the last Thursday of November a national day of Thanksgiving, Lincoln asked for, quote, "the almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union." His first national celebration of Thanksgiving occurred 1 week after he delivered his inspiring dedication at Gettysburg. When a turkey was gifted to the White House for this first national holiday dinner, Lincoln's son, Tad, named it Jack and adopted it into his large White House menagerie. Upon learning that Jack, the turkey, was going to be killed and served for Thanksgiving dinner, Tad broke into a cabinet meeting and cried on his father's lap. Pausing the meeting, Lincoln took a piece of White House stationery and, probably with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, scowling at him, he penned a presidential pardon for the bird, thus beginning a tradition that continues to this day. The next November, as Lincoln was running for re-election, he saw the turkey watching voters walking toward a polling booth. Grinning, he asked his son, "Well, Tad, does your turkey vote?" "No, Dad, Jack is not yet of age." So let me just read that. Let me just read it. It's only 2 minutes, so let me just read it for you. The declaration here. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Is there anybody who would like to start out with a comment or question for us?
Well, I'll just mention the juxtaposition of this noble address, which accurately connects to the Declaration of Independence, is done at this battlefield where thousands of people have been wounded or died. I don't remember the figures. And Lincoln had some compassion for the Southerners too. It's all of them. And what an awful, did it have to happen? Historians can debate that. But it was decisive, and it helped. It helped since it actually involved the invasion of the North. Northerners had to pay attention to the war. It wasn't just something happening in Mississippi. So what better way to honor and commiserate all those who participated in this battle than to come forth with such a statement as he made.
Showing a really magnanimous spirit.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is said that when he finished, the audience was kind of stunned at the brevity of the talk and were absolutely silent. And there was a little boy who was hiding underneath the platform. And he was so quiet that he could hear the footfalls of Lincoln as he went back to his seat, because everyone was just stunned for a minute until finally they realized that he was done as he sat down. and then started to applaud. There was about 10,000 people in audience there. There was 23,000 people that died on the Union side at Gettysburg and 28,000 that died on the Confederate side. Almost 50,000 soldiers died in that 2-3 days of battle that ended on July the 4th in 1863. And he saw a through line between that battle that ended on July the 4th and the passing of both two of the greatest early presidents who were best friends and enemies, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who both died on the same July 4th day, as well as the July 4th itself that was 87 years before. And then he delivered this address in November, a number of months after the actual battle, but there was still the stench of the dead there on the battlefield. The Confederates were only buried under a couple inches of soil at the time. Many of the Union soldiers were taken in caskets back home and then brought back to be buried in the new cemeteries. So there were caskets all around with, the dead in them. It was a grim sight. And they said that after the battle, you could walk across the battlefields without ever touching the ground, just stepping from body to body. In the Civil War, there were over 600,000 people, 600,000 casualties, greater than all the numbers of all soldiers that died in all of the other wars of the United States have been engaged in, from the Revolutionary War all the way up to the Iraq War. It was, I believe, 10% of the population was killed during that war. It was tragic, and relatives against relatives during that war.
So if we feel divided as a nation now, it's maybe fairly mild compared to what was going on at that time. I wonder if we can kind of take heart from it. We survived the Civil War, which was so terrible.
Exactly.
What I wonder that people might help me answer is, why is a proposition of equality so difficult for people to accept? People talk about, well, we're hostile to the other or whatever, but there's something about that proposition, all men are created equal, that seems to be so threatening. And if that could be dissolved, it could make for less division, obviously. So does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Such a great question.
I think a lot of people see the world, this is Todd, as a place of duality and a place of conflict, and a place where the only way I get ahead is by somebody else falling back. And there are people who think that, our race, human beings in general, are by nature conflictual, that we have, that we see things in terms of taking, and that we see things in a way that if we don't protect ourselves, someone else is gonna, if we don't do this and somebody else will, that someone's coming, that, that human history is rife with conflict, and, that there's me, and then there's the enemy, it's us and them. And I think it's just a recurring theme, whether it's good and evil, black and white, whatever it is, it's us and them. And if you look at the way a lot of nefarious leaders come to power, it's often by just highlighting and pointing out people's differences and creating the boogeyman, creating the counterpoint that these people are coming and they're going to take what you have, and there's not enough to go around. And I think that the notion that if we're all a brotherhood, it really the idea that we're going to have to share what we have as we would in our family or within a brotherhood, that the fear of scarcity or the fear of limited resources or the fear of the imperative to care for others who haven't worked as hard as I am or aren't as deserving as I am. And I think that's the way a lot of people's psyche are wired, unfortunately.
Is it the case? Thank you, Todd. I think you're right. And I wonder whether those of you who might know history better than I do, is it the case that America's Declaration of Independence, as well as, this Civil War that we fought, was somewhat unique in not taking like the inequalities for granted, the inequalities for people, a built-in set of, for example, social hierarchies or political hierarchies. It seems like America didn't take those as a given, perhaps. And was that new to rebel against that idea, even if we could not live up to it, but just as an idea to not accept that differentiation amongst peoples as okay. Yeah, I don't know who Virginia Saltwater is. Is that John?
John
John
Power.
Would be me.
Hey, John.
Hi. So, commenting on Carolyn's question, I think there are a couple of things about that are really important from an historical point of view. One is that, I mean, it's well recognized that America's original sin was proclaiming that all men are created equal and beginning our nation, or shortly thereafter, with slavery intact, and actually promoted as part of a compromise to get the states to join together into one united body. And the compromises that were made were not speedily resolved in favor of equality. And it's kind of like a cancer that was left to grow. And all that karma that's accumulated over generations of treatment of minorities in this country, especially Blacks, well known to all of us, through the Jim Crow era after Reconstruction, and that whole sordid history of the United States in refusing to take a strong stand on the basis of equality, is playing out right now. It's come back and smacked us right in the face in the form of white supremacy and all the various forms of chaos that we're seeing these days. So it's karma of those of us who are Americans coming back to roost. And now we're faced with a difficult choice. People have to either choose the larger circle, drawing the larger circle, or they're going to go for smaller circles and exclusiveness and excluding certain people from their sympathies, from having the same rights as one wants for oneself. So it's a complex time, but it really is a moment of choice for Americans.
Do you think that's the case, John? Because the choice is so much more obvious right now that the lines have been drawn pretty clearly. Is that why there's more of a moment of choice now between that and another time?
Well, I can't really say, Renee, exactly, but I think we're at a time where these kinds of choices have to be made self-consciously, knowing what the implications are, because we're too grown up as a country to hide the implications of the choices. And people only hide those implications when they deliberately deceive themselves. Somewhere there's a lie in the soul that I think keeps people from seeing things clearly. And that kind of lack of fundamental decency towards others and lack of self-knowledge and lack of self-awareness contributes to it. But why it should all come to a head now, it's mysterious, but why shouldn't it? You know, it's been going on for 300 years, and karma has to ripen and play itself out, and we all have to deal with the sins of our fathers, forefathers, and our own.
Yeah. Cliff, I wonder, I mean, when we're talking about these things and not having the wisdom to recognize the equality of all human beings, what light, what guidance does gratitude give, and how can you trace it perhaps in Lincoln's life toward wisdom? How does gratitude help us get the kind of wisdom? And even in his life, I don't think he was someone who at the beginning of his life saw the abolition of slavery as being critical, if I understand that correctly. Can you talk on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I was trying to say something about the connection between gratitude and wisdom, but I think gratitude creates a posture where when one sees what one is thankful for, when one sees what one has been given to oneself, then from that posture of being given to, hopefully that triggers in us a willingness to give. And I think that, along with what Todd was saying, helps us to maybe make some kind of internal change between seeing a world of scarcity and seeing more of a deeper world of plenty. Because when we're living in a world of scarcity, then we seem to want to hold everything tight, right? But if we can see more the fullness of nature and actually the fullness of our own ability to give, the more I think we start to see a deeper realm where equality is present. Lincoln is an interesting study because the people often, without studying him deeply, say that he came around to his opposition to slavery late, but that's not actually true. He was appalled and abhorred by slavery from a very early age. At a very early age, he took a river, he built a raft and took a bunch of I don't know, a whole bunch of produce and stuff down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And when he got to New Orleans and he saw the slave trade, he was just devastated by it and always felt it was an evil. But he also had this intuitive sense of timing that he said that with consensus, with consensus of the public, everything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. He was very good at reading the attitudes of the general public. And so he knew he couldn't just go for the abolition of slavery right off at the beginning of the Civil War. He inherited the Civil War. When he came into office, a number of Southern states had already seceded from the Union, but he inherited it, but he couldn't come out right away and say that this Civil War is about the ending of slavery, because he wouldn't have had the support. But he did say later, along with John's point, that there's a karma to our having slavery as a part of our country and at its foundation and so forth, in that he said maybe this war, for every drop of blood that has been taken by the whip, will have to be replaced by drops of blood taken by the sword. And so it was a kind of, he saw the karma of almost the necessity of going through that war. And that war could have been won so early by the North, but for all these failings and all these terrible mistakes by the early generals, that war went on for 5 years with lots of drops of blood because of it. But somehow through it, it's almost like through that, we were able to begin to break away from some of the entrenched racism of the early beginnings of our country. But I would also argue that we always are in a time of choice, and that the idealism of America is like a fire, but it's always surrounded by smoke. So it's not just particularly at the time of the Civil War or the revolutionary times or now. Every generation has these difficult choices to make, and it's always going to be difficult to move towards the ideal of pure and true brotherhood and equality. I think that is one of the qualities of Lincoln that might get unnoticed the most, is his timing, his sense of timing throughout his presidency, when he was able to do certain things, because he knew he had the support of the people. And he had an interesting tradition in the White House of what he called his public opinion baths. So there was always tons of just average folks lining the halls of the White House, waiting for a meeting with the president. And he met with hours and hours on end every day with just common folks who he'd hear their stories, he'd hear their requests. Some of them were trying to get, positions with the executive branch or what have you. But it was through those meetings that he could get the pulse of the common man and see where things were going. And that's well shown out in that wonderful movie by Steven Spielberg called About Abraham Lincoln. It's a wonderful movie. I recommend it to everyone to see, because the portrayal of Lincoln and everyone in that movie, the portrayal of all of his cabinet members, and it was to me, so accurate. But those public opinion baths were something that he felt obliged to do to get that sense of when he could take certain actions.
It sounds as though he had appreciation, in other words, gratitude, for the opinion of every single one of those people whom he treated, it sounds like, very equally. It didn't matter if they had some huge high position in his government, or probably a foreign government, or in, the world of business or whatever, or if they were just a very humble farmer coming to talk to him. He considered each of their opinions equally and with gratitude, it sounds like. So he was able to sort of call the collective wisdom of the nation in that manner.
When Frederick Douglass came to the White House to talk to Lincoln, because when finally Blacks were allowed in the Army, they weren't paid as much. And he was given the task of recruiting Blacks for the Union Army. He came to complain to Lincoln, and there was, like usual, hundreds of people in the halls, and Frederick Douglass thought he was going to have to sit there forever. But as soon as his name was taken into the Lincoln's office, Frederick Douglass was ushered in very quickly. And Frederick Douglass said or wrote later that he had never had a white man treat him as an equal as much as Lincoln had treated Frederick Douglass. He was just amazed at the sincerity and honesty and lack of superiority that Lincoln gave to Frederick Douglass, and always considered Frederick Douglass his brother after he gave his second inaugural, which some say was his greatest speech, where he gave the famous phrase of malice towards none, not taking any retribution on the Confederates at the end of the war. He asked Frederick Douglass's opinion on that. He said, "I saw you out there listening to my inaugural. What did you think of it?" And I can't remember exactly the quote that Frederick Douglass said, but Frederick Douglass says, "It was very good for the occasion. It was very good."
Well, still, how can we learn to love other people, but how can we discover that we do share so much? I mean, even just in short encounters, you go to a store or something, you can have little interactions that just remind you that we do share. And I guess it's a real fault in leadership and greedy and all that doesn't put out a better message. And this forum we had this afternoon at the Institute of World Culture, through a succession of decades, people finally got the idea that we had within us, there was a quality in our potential, that in the very most sacred, insightful part of ourselves, and that was way above the physical body, it was the same. And because we were connected to the source of that human potential and that light and that fraternity and all of that. So somehow we have to, have more people discover who they really are. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And then they have to believe both that what they have, and children have it naturally. I mean, for all the fistfights that kindergartners might get into, you can see a lot of signs of, hey, this is a buddy, this is someone I can play with, etc. So it's the adults have, maybe high school ruins people, I don't know. But it's just, how do we just come to enjoy people enough that we, or recognize their accomplishments, or do something to see that not everybody's an enemy and they don't have to fear everybody. They can, because then they'd be much happier within themselves. Usually if we've had some positive experience with interacting with others, whether we know them or not, we're happier. So that's not a question, but it's still. But the conditions of life, trying to road rage in the freeway, or, higher prices at the grocery store, whatever, the conditions of life somehow, I guess, discourage us from a positive feeling about others.
Oprah recommends travel.
Oh,
She feels as if when we travel and we encounter people from different parts of the world, and often, when we are traveling, we are helped along the way in unexpected ways. I think a lot of us find. And then we also find out that there are more similarities than differences a lot of times.
yeah.
So that's one of the recommendations that she makes. Cliff?
Just another interesting historical tidbit is that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, his opening line was, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable."
Mhm.
And Benjamin Franklin changed sacred and undeniable to self-evident. We
Evident.
hold these truths to be self-evident, which has so much power to it. But I think, Carolyn, you're right that young children see equality as self-evident. It's just something that we know intuitively, but then something kind of, as we develop into a, certain society, that somehow gets changed, but I think it's always there. It's like something that follows us all the time, that we know we're all part of one family. We don't have to appeal to gods or whatever. We know deep down, all of us, that we're all part of one family. Why aren't we acting like it? But for Lincoln, he studied Euclid a lot. And he memorized Euclid's elements, and all of his Euclid's elements were propositions. So when he says 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, he's kind of connecting back to Euclid. And the idea that there's almost like a mathematics to idealism and truth that Lincoln was very much onto. Oh, anyways, that's a thought on that.
I don't get it yet. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, I started to get worry in my own mind a little bit on that. Sorry, but
it's something like one human being equals another human being because they're both human beings, something like that.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's in the movie about Abraham Lincoln, where I think he's talking to two of the guys in the telegraph office about Euclid, where he says that, one of Euclid's propositions is that if two things are equal to the same thing, they are equal to one another. So if a black man is a human being and a white man is a human being, they're equally human beings, therefore they're equal to one another. So it's almost there's a moral mathematics and a moral or a mathematics to ethics. And yet we obscure these things in our own minds to justify superiority, inferiority, whatever. But deep down, it's like our shadow following us. This knowledge that we are all equal, ultimately, everybody knows it. It's just that some of us cover it over with self-justification and other forms of self-centeredness.
Well, Lincoln had two assets that aren't usually in the short history books. At a fairly early stage after he'd moved to Springfield, he did get appointed as a circuit court judge, which meant that he had to travel around actually quite distances to hear cases, legal cases, and to make decisions about it. And he does comment on how much he learns about kind of getting out in the country and seeing what's bothering people or why they're disturbed about, some property dispute or something like that. So he really does have a lot of experience in human beings as they are. And someone made the comment recently that one of the problems of our congressmen, they never get out there and actually really see people as they actually are and living and things like that. And then, not to degrade the conversation, but also when he was traveling and had to stay in rather rudimentary hotels, it was common for 3 or 4 people to share the same bed. And now, of course, we drive into a hotel motel and, keep our separation quite a bit. But so he just kind of absorbed interaction with others, and he could see their good qualities and their mistakes and things like that. So that's, you don't separate yourself so much. You don't have fear so much if you've actually had to interact with others.
Yeah. On that note, actually, he wasn't a judge; he was a lawyer.
That's right.
He did travel with Judge Davis,
and
a bunch of other lawyers from town to town, and it was like a festival or a circus coming to town. It was a big deal for the people. They would all come to the courtroom for the theatrics of it all. But apparently Judge Davis and Lincoln were very, they had great admiration for one another. And it was Judge Davis who orchestrated Lincoln's ability to win the election as president. He was the mastermind really behind everything that happened in the was it the Cincinnati Convention or whatever? But apparently there was one time where Judge Davis and Lincoln were sharing the same bed in one of these rustic taverns, and they got into a discussion about the equality of man and slavery, and Lincoln was taking the position that all men are created equal in their debate. And finally, the conversation went on for a long time until finally Judge Davis fell asleep. And when he woke up in the morning, Lincoln was sitting on the edge of the bed and wanted to continue the discussion. Judge Davis says, "Come on, Lincoln, we got to go have breakfast."
So, yeah. So that's the solution.
But you're right, Carolyn. He had a very close and tight encounters with so many common people, and I think that's where he drew his great reservoir of stories, was from all those travels on the circuit and all the conversation, all the stories you would hear in all the villages. He had an encyclopedic memory for all those funny stories, and he would share them all the time, apparently driving Edwin Stanton nuts. There's a good little scene in the Lincoln movie about him sharing a story during a critical time during the Civil War, and Edward Stanton going, "No, not another story, not now."
Yeah. It's such a tragedy he was assassinated when he was, because it really created a problem.
Yeah, the day before he was assassinated, he and Mary were in a carriage together, and he was saying to Mary, we haven't been happy for a long time, you and I. We've been kind of miserable, but now let's make a new beginning. Let's maybe think about maybe going to Europe and I think Jerusalem and California, and let's try and be happier together. And then the next day he was assassinated.
Yeah.
Since our topic is wisdom and gratitude, can you make a connection between humor, storytelling, for example, humor in the form of storytelling, and wisdom, or possibly gratitude?
Well, I hope it does do that. I choose my stories with that in mind, I'm sure, but I never interpret. I never comment to children about what this possibly means. I think the story itself has to take that message with it. I shouldn't need to point this out to them, but the stories come from way back, so they carry with them. The reason that they have endured is because they've carried with them wisdom and other important things, and so I feel it's really important for the kids to hear all these different things and let them take away from them what they will. So I'm not using stories as a way to preach to them anything. I simply choose the stories that I think will be meaningful to them and that I think are meaningful, period, and then let that up to them.
That sounds as if you have a lot of trust in them as equal human beings that you don't have to clunk over the head with your interpretation of what these stories mean, that you trust that the stories you tell are going to speak to their, their finer natures, and that they have that finer nature that will be able to grasp it.
Well, it's because you choose the stories, like I wouldn't tell Prometheus to and myself. I wouldn't tell it for anybody less than a fifth or sixth grader. They wouldn't get the gist of that story. So I choose my stories for the audience. So when I go into a school and I'm telling stories from pre-K through fifth grade, I have 20 or 30 stories for that particular week for the individual age groups. So that's the way I try to make sure that they would understand what I think is the meaning of the story.
Yeah, that sounds wise. Yeah, that each of us, the fact that each of us inherently has the ability to see this wisdom doesn't mean that we're always all at the same place at the same time. That just like a child has to develop into different levels of understanding, probably the rest of us have to do that on other levels. And it doesn't mean that anybody is completely unable to grasp wisdom. They just could be at a different level in their development. Perhaps might be a way of looking at it.
Well, and many stories can be told for a first grader or fifth grader, depending on what version you use, But when I'm storytelling, that's what I'm doing. I'm storytelling. I'm not preaching. I'm not teaching. I'm just wanting them to enjoy this story. And the stories I choose are those that I think bring them some type of understanding or wisdom or humor, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I would love to say thank you, Cliff. I didn't have anything to contribute because the information and the talking that everybody was doing was really making questions in my mind, but I could not form them into something to present. But I'm just very grateful to hear about the different aspects of Lincoln. Being born and raised in Hawaii, I have very limited experience with just talking about Gettysburg and the area. It's so foreign to me. And from being raised in Hawaii and having different people from different cultures here it's been interesting. And I believe we are all formed by who our family is, and how we react to others is how we were taught. And that doesn't mean we can't get better, because I do find that the older I am, I hope that I'm kinder than I used to be, and that even one person can do a lot, even if they do it just for one other person. Kindness is never wasted. And thank you, Cliff and Renee, for all that you do to make our lives so rich. Aloha.
Oh.